So our last water quality measurement, once again just from the top, the temperature of the water here is 19.7, so a little bit cooler, and you'd expect that because we've got a nice canopy of trees above us. The electrical conductivity, 300 microsiemens per centimetre, so once again up a little bit higher than our last site, so it's gradually increasing as we're coming up the creek. It's not a bad thing, it's not telling us that the water's salty, it's telling us that there's more nutrient in there. The pH in here is 5.59, so 5.6, and that's very much what we would expect in a natural, unaltered system in this part of the world. Close to the pH of rainfall, similar to the pH of the soil that we measured earlier. And so if you consider the system, rain, slightly acidic rain, falling onto the soil, seeping through the soil and ultimately emerging into the creek, you'd expect the pH to be around 5.6, and it is. NTU, so nephelometric turbidity units, is 6.1. So once again, just a little bit more sediment than we've seen in earlier sites. And just so you know, I was in a very shallow pool to collect the water, so I probably stirred up a bit of mud in doing that. Now the measurement that I've left to last, because it's the most interesting one, is the dissolved oxygen measurement. And it's 32%. So very, very much lower than anything we've seen during the course of the day. And once again, this is not a measurement that's right or wrong. It's a measurement that's telling you something about what's happening in the system here. And so the water in this part is seeping through the soil, interacting with the organic matter on the floor of the forest here. So there's lots of organisms that are breaking down organic matter that are using up oxygen. It's all shaded, so there's not the algae that were in the water at the other side generating oxygen. So we're now in a system where there's a lot more use of oxygen than there is either creation of oxygen by the algae or diffusion of oxygen into the water from the atmosphere. So we have a very low dissolved oxygen value. And if we were thinking about fish, they'd probably be very unhappy in that water. But of course here, there aren't any fish in the system at the moment, certainly, because the water's largely seeping through the soil rather than running on the surface. Now, just to continue our thoughts about water quality, in this part of the system, there's a huge opportunity for water to be cleaned up by this environment. As the water soaks through the soil, if there are contaminants in the water, and there are often contaminants in water in our urban systems, our vehicles, and you can hear trucks driving past me right now, making a lot of racket. Our vehicles are all driving on rubber tyres that have been vulcanised, made harder by using sulphur and zinc in them. As those tyres wear out, the zinc's released. Our roads still have a lot of lead blowing around on them from the days when we had lead in our fuel. We have lots of copper pipes in our houses. We use molybdenum in the oil in our cars that drips out on the road. So there's lots of metals which will end up in the water that runs off our road. Now that water in flowing through this piece of forest here, all of those contaminant metals would be collected. Organic contaminants like the oil that might come off the road, the same microorganisms that are breaking down the forest leaf litter will break those up. So these are systems that can clean up water. The water comes out in better quality than it went in. So finally, just to bring our walk up Ross Creek to an end, this is our last site, and we think it's a really nice site for you to reflect on what the rest of the catchment might have been like. This is very much an analogue of the vegetation that we would have seen right from the time we left the salt water. So at that first site where we measured low electrical conductivity in the water, we'd moved away from the area where you'd have mangroves in the salty water. We moved into an area where you were going to have these melaleuca trees, paper barks, as the dominant vegetation. So this is a great thinking analogue to what you would have seen up the rest of the creek. At the last site, I suggested to you that there's been a big change in the way our community looks at creeks like this, because we've moved from the creek being a drain lined with concrete that no one wants to be near, to the creek being lakes, the attractive dimension to the housing estate that everyone wants to live near. So I wonder, are we as a community close to the point at which people won't want a created lake? They'll want a Melaleuca swamp like this one. Now, your first thought might be, a Melaleuca swamp, that's a bad idea. That's got to smell bad. Well, no, certainly not. You might think, there's got to be a heap of mosquitoes in there. Neil, are you being chewed by mosquitoes? Well, no, I'm not. And the reason for that is that this is an ecosystem in equilibrium. Yep, sure, there'd be some mosquitoes in here and they'd lay some eggs in the water and some tadpoles would eat them, or some little fish, okay? There is an equilibrium here of all of the various creatures that belong in this community all together. I guess the one thing that finally might spring to mind is, what about the snakes that are going to live in there, Neil? And let me assure you, I live on the western suburbs of Brisbane where there are brown snakes in nicely mown yards. So that's a reflection of the part of the world we live in, and I don't think much more of a risk here than elsewhere. So I do look forward to the day when this would be a deck on somebody's house and I can sit out here and have a quiet beer at the end of my Ross Creek walk, enjoying the cool, as Hamish described to you, the effect of evaporation out of this wetter part of the landscape, and the peace. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed your virtual walk up Ross Creek. It's been interesting for us to do it. We hope we've conveyed our message to you well.